Welcome everyone. I'm Anne Single. This is the Patient Voice Initiative webinar, and this evening I'm going to be moderating this session. I'm the coordinator with the Patient Voice Initiative, and normally our chair, Jessica Bean, who's a patient advocate, would be doing this role, but unfortunately she's unable to join us tonight. So before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the Yagara and the Turrbal as the traditional custodians of the land where I live and work. And excuse me, there's more things flicking at me. There we go. For those of you who aren't familiar with Patient Voice Initiative, we are a multidisciplinary group that advocates for patients to be seen, heard and valued in healthcare decision making, especially health technology assessments. And we regularly do webinars, and tonight we're doing something a little bit different. Rather than talking about how medicines and medical services are reimbursed in Australia, we're looking at how it works elsewhere. So we're still talking about the process called health technology assessment that is used to determine if new medicines and medical services are sufficiently good value to be reimbursed in Australia. But we're looking to learn from how others do HTA with patients. So thank you to those of you who are giving us your evening. As to do this, we have moved from our usual webinar time. And tonight we have three very experienced patient representatives to give us some insights into how HTA works for patients, where they live and how patients are involved. With us live, we have Kate Morgan joining us from Scotland and Zack Pemberton-Whitely in England. And via pre-record, due to the time difference, we have Deb Maskens from Canada. So Kate is the Head of Policy and Access at Myeloma Patients Europe, and she holds a bachelor's degree in government and a master's degree in international and European politics. Kate worked for 8 years on the policy team at Myeloma UK, where she influenced a range of policy, HTA and reimbursement decisions affecting patient access to good quality care and effective medicines. She represented the patient voice in a number of patient and public advisory panels in the UK health system, including the Scottish Medicines Consortium, that's the HTA body in Scotland, on optimising patient involvement in decision making. Most recently, she was appointed to the steering committee of the HTAI Interest Group for Patient and Citizen Involvement in HTA. Welcome, Kate. And our other guest is Zack. Zack is the Chief Executive at Leukaemia Care, the UK's leading leukemia charity. He's a qualified lawyer, and he also chairs the Global Acute Leukaemia Advocates Network. He co-chairs the Blood Cancer Alliance in the UK, and he's vice chair of the European Haematology Association Patient Advocacy Committee. And he's active in committees and advisory boards at a UK, European and global level, including the CML Advocates Network Steering Committee and Community Advisory Board, the work group of the European Cancer Patient Advocacy Networks, WeCan, and the European Cancer Organisation Patient Advisory Committee. You're a busy person, Zack. Welcome. And our other speaker is Deb Maskens, and Deb is a long-time kidney cancer patient and patient advocate. She co-founded Kidney Cancer Canada in 2016 with another patient and has focused on advocacy, health technology assessment, patient support and navigation. Deb currently volunteers for several kidney cancer patient organisations, including the Kidney Cancer Association in the US. She helped found and lead a wide range of advocacy groups, both at home in Canada and internationally. And you'll see in this interview why she believes global networks are so critical for patient organisations. In 2016, Deb was awarded the Canadian Governor-General's Meritorious Service Medal, Canada's highest award for her dedication and professionalism in patient advocacy and volunteer service. So we're going to get tonight started by showing you part of an interview we pre-recorded with Deb, but I'd recommend you watch or listen to the full 28 minutes on our YouTube channel, where Deb provides a really wide-ranging group of insights into this area. And so this pre-record is some of the questions I'm going to put to Zack and Kate in a minute.
So let's start with, yes, we have universal health care in Canada. So our system is in many ways a lot like the Australian system. It's a lot like the systems in the UK and in Europe, and is very unlike the large country that sits below Canada. So let's put that system aside. So in Canada, we have a federal piece of legislation called the Canada Health Act, and that ensures that we do not pay for anything that's done to us in a hospital. We never pay for a doctor's visit. We don't pay to give birth to a child, et cetera, et cetera. All of that is automatically covered from our tax dollars that we are happy to pay. And it's one thing that as Canadians, if anybody tries to muddle with the idea of universal healthcare, they get shot down in a hurry. So we believe in universal healthcare. But that said, we also have a system similar to your states. We have provinces, and each province has jurisdiction over how healthcare is implemented in their province. So there really isn't one Canadian health system. There's many, at least a dozen, depending upon where you live. And when that comes to access to medications, we are trying our best to harmonize across the country. But as I'm sure is true in other countries, there are parts of the country that have more money than other parts. And so if you live in a part of the country in our East Coast, a small island, you might not have access to the same medication. And that's just a reality of our Canadian system. Canada has a very well established HTA system that is actually not a federal system, but it's called a pan-Canadian system. So all the provinces come together at a table and fund the HTA for all of Canada. So in theory, we would have some universality of recommendations and decisions. So that's where we're working together. So HTA is well grounded. We also have separately from our HTAs, we have our regulatory agency. So the way that we map a drug, I'm saying a drug, but it could be a technology, a drug, normally we pay attention when the FDA approves something. My personal opinion is that the bar at the FDA is getting lower and lower and lower. So the FDA often approves something with accelerated approval, it comes through very quickly, and then we start our clock. And we start watching what happens. So usually it's submitted to our regulatory. That will come through usually in about 6 months from the US. And so that's good. That means the drug is safe and effective. And if you have private insurance on top of the universal coverage, you might be able to access it then once it's been regulatory approved. But for the vast majority of Canadians, they have to wait for HTA to go through its process. And then for the pricing negotiations, which in our system is actually a subsequent step, for the pricing negotiations to happen with the government. And so that entire timeline from FDA, if I count it from the US, to a patient having access in Canada, that can be 2 years. So that's, you know, I work in cancer, I volunteer my time in cancer, and in advanced cancer, you can't wait 2 years if something is really effective. So as patient groups, we have to understand that whole system and kind of follow a drug through its many steps. And it gets stuck sometimes, and sometimes it gets stuck because industry's not negotiating to the extent that the government wants them to. And so what we do is we don't get involved in that per se, but what we do is we make sure that a patient in need has access somehow, some way. And so as patient groups, we have sort of a list of, I'll say, tactics of what we will go through. But we push for compassionate access programs. We push for, you know, very quietly giving a patient access and not letting it get to the media. And then in worst case scenario, we'll go for the front page. That's not ideally how HTA works. I'm sorry, I said it.
But I understand the need there. And so in Australia, in our HTA health technology assessment system, patients can really only start to get involved in the medicines assessments at that appraisal stage when it's coming into committee for that deliberation. I think in Canada they can get involved a bit earlier, can they? And how does that happen? And can you tell us a bit about your thoughts about earlier involvement in this area?
Yeah, I think my overall thought is that at HTA appraisal, it's too late. I mean, yes, you absolutely have to get involved because you need to state the position and to do your best for patients. But it really is too late in the game when you have, data from trials and it's not what you wanted, and sometimes they've used the wrong comparison drug, and all kinds of things that you wanted collected were not even asked. So it's a pretty crappy point in time to come in at the very end and to have been ignored for all of the steps prior to that. So I would say that in Canada right now, officially with our HTAs, we don't have a seat at early scientific advice when companies are first saying, I'm thinking about approaching about this drug. So we don't get involved at that point. There is a two-step part of it's called CADIF is our agency. We have 2 steps where we can get involved, but I would really urge patient groups to think about how much of your resources do you want to spend at the end versus how much do you want to spend in trying to influence the data that you're going to end up with. So I've become involved much more in clinical trial design, and Canada's a huge country geographically, but we don't really matter that much to drug companies if we're honest. For global pharmaceutical companies, the Canadian population at like 37 million is just like a blip. So what we've realized is if you want to influence the clinical trial, you have to get to the global pharmaceutical company. So work through your country organization, but try to get at those tables where you're discussing unmet patient needs, what we can do better in the next trial, how we need to better measure things like quality of life, because measuring it in these questionnaires doesn't make any sense. So there's a need to do that. There's a need to do that early stuff. But if you are finding yourself and it's late in the day and you have 30 days, that's our window in Canada, 30 days to put together an HTA submission, then you scramble. And what we do when we're scrambling is we go out to patients with patient surveys, and we try to ask the questions that the trial didn't ask. So we put the submission in, and then after the submission has gone through, there's a deliberative meeting. We're not invited to that deliberation meeting. We're not on the phone. We have nothing to do with that. So we send it in and we get an acknowledgement that it has been received. And then there's a meeting that happens, and there is a public and or patient representative who then represents our submission, which again, I don't think is best practice. I think the best practices are really in England and in Scotland, where patient groups can be there in person to answer questions. But in our system, we're not involved. We get their draft recommendation, and we have an opportunity to appeal at that point or send in a second submission if we think they have not followed due process. But it's not just to say, I disagree. You can't just disagree. You have to have a reason for disagreeing. So that is the process, and then it becomes a final recommendation once we've all had an opportunity to say, yes, you did something, or no, you didn't consider X, Y, and Z. So that's how our system works. It's a work in progress. It's not perfect. And personally, I look to Scotland and to England as having far better advancements, I think, in patient engagement in HTA.
That's interesting. So same here, as we can't see what goes on in these HTA meetings, but a slight difference in process there in this ability to see a draft recommendation. So do you get feedback about the input or the submissions you make?
Yes, and that has actually been something positive in the last few years. We demanded some feedback because otherwise it was just like throwing something over a wall. And so now there's a feedback letter. Now, I'll be honest to say that it's not always helpful. So sometimes they will say, we acknowledge that you did an online survey, but it was only, a small sample. Well, we did our best. Sometimes we've had feedback that says, You didn't poll enough of the Indigenous population, of the rural population, of Canada's far north, and you read this in the feedback and you think, how on earth could we? This is a volunteer effort. And sometimes they say an online survey is limited, that you really should be doing one-on-one interviews with patients. So we are resource restrained, and they want the stars, the moon, and everything, and we just can't get there. We need to be a fully fledged research agency to deliver everything that they want. And I've sometimes questioned how much money or what they think we really do, because in the organization that I started in Canada, Kidney Cancer Canada, we are there to help patients who've just had a life-threatening diagnosis. That is our raison d'etre, if I can throw in a bit of French. And so that's what we do. That's our mandate. This other HTA stuff of doing patient surveys and trying to find patients who are taking this drug, that's separate, but it's also really important. And so sometimes it's a little bit disheartening when they say, well, here are all the things that you didn't do. I was busy helping a patient stay alive that day.
Thanks, Deb. And as you know, we're scheduled to have an HTA review here in Australia over the next 12 months. And we're also, as part of that, I should say, we're having work is being done to co-design an enhanced consumer engagement system. And I wondered, what aspects of the Canadian system do you think are really good that we should look at and learn from?
Well, I know you use that word consumer, and we don't use that word consumer. So I think one of the aspects has been patient involvement in the deliberative committees. There's a very different tone when you have a patient representative versus a public representative. So there's a distinction there. And I think certainly in the cancer drugs review, we've made sure that there is a patient representative, because if you haven't had a diagnosis like this and you're thinking that all drugs are the same, you don't have the same urgency. So that is something I think that we can offer that has been really good. In other pieces of our system, the opportunity to appeal, or to come back on the draft recommendation, that's been really important to us. And that feedback letter that we get at the end, even if we don't always like it, the feedback letter is also important. I think where I'd like to see us go forward is to have more one-on-one trusted dialogue between the patient organization and the HTA people inside. What often happens, and forgive me because I know you have academic credentials, but what often happens is that they hire people who have PhDs in patient engagement, and they go off and have these discussions among themselves about patient engagement and how it should be done, but it's all very academic and sort of obtuse. And I think what we bring is what it's like actually as a patient when you are trying to navigate your disease at the same time as that you're trying to navigate drug access and the financial implications of all of that. So we bring a dose of reality to people who have studied patient engagement, but they haven't walked it the way that we've walked it. One of the parts I'm really proud of in our cancer drugs in Canada, that over 95% of the submissions, even for the rarest cancer drugs, they have a patient submission. Are they all of the same quality? Absolutely not. But every time some group puts something in. And so some of the umbrella organizations, I know in Australia you have Rare Cancers Australia, but for some of those bigger groups to pick up a submission when nobody else is going to be able to do it, I think it's vital. And they can't do this without us. They should not be allowed to do this without us. That's my plea.
So that was Deb Maskens talking, and I do encourage you to check out our YouTube channel and watch the rest of that interview because I really think she was on fire. I'm really glad now to turn the lens to the UK because, as Deb said, that's where she's really inspired by what's going on. And before I start, the way we wanted to run this is I've got a series of questions we've got prepared to ask Zack and Kate, and then we can already see some great questions coming in the chat. Zack and Kate, what I didn't ask you when we were changing Zoom links, do you have a hard stop on the half hour, or is there any chance can I steal 15 minutes more? Am I pushing the friendship? Yeah. Thank you. Very generous of you. So I'll get you to turn your microphones on now. And Kate, I'll go to you first. Can you just give us a bit of context? Can you tell us just a little bit about health technology assessment and the health system in Scotland?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. So in Scotland, it's quite similar to Canada and Australia. So our healthcare system is known as the National Health Service, and it's publicly funded using tax, and it's free at the point of care for anyone that wants to use it. And for high cost medicines to become available, they first have to be assessed by our health technology assessment body, which is called the Scottish Medicines Consortium. And what they essentially do is they assess the clinical and cost effectiveness data in relation to the medicine, and they provide guidance to our 14 health boards on whether or not it constitutes a valuable use of NHS resources. So unlike in England, SMC guidance has no legal mandate here. But what happens is that health boards typically do follow SMC guidance. Otherwise, I think within 3 months, they have to publish a decision on their website justifying why they haven't followed it. So it typically, SMC guidance rolls out quite effectively. And I think it doesn't really make sense for there to be sort of 14 different decisions in Scotland because we're a very small country. So patients typically get access to what the SMC says.
Oh, thanks, Kate. Sorry, go on.
The one final point I wanted to make about the SMC was that I think compared to England and a lot of other HTA bodies is that it's a very flexible process. So I think they use these things called decision-making modifiers, which allow them to accept things that may not fit within the sort of traditional cost effectiveness range, but it enables sort of dynamic and responsive decision making compared to NICE, which is very sort of quite rigid and method based. So I think that's a really strong point about the SMC decision making.
Just before I hand over to Zack, could you give us an example of a modifier?
Yeah, so I think there are 3 different modifiers that they can apply, and so one would be for a medicine that meets that's a rare disease, or for a medicine that's for the end of life. So they're typically willing to sort of accept something that's a bit more expensive because it meets quite a big unmet need for patients in Scotland.
Oh, thank you. And Zack, how does that compare with you south of the border there?
So England and Scotland from a health system perspective are pretty similar. So technically in the UK, obviously there's 4 countries in the UK, health is a devolved issue. So obviously, as Kate says, Scotland has authority over its own health system, but England sort of links as like the whole UK system. So they're pretty similar. It's the same National Health Service. They're just technically different organisations, NHS England, NHS Scotland. Obviously, as Kate said, the actual HTA process is different. So in England, we have a body called NICE, which is the National Institute for Healthcare Excellence, which is effectively the equivalent of the SMC in Scotland, albeit much, much bigger, as Kate says, quite a bit less flexible, a bit more rigid in its process. That has pros and cons to its approach. It has various different processes for different kinds of treatment. So very, very rare treatments, which are called highly specialized technologies, have a totally different process. But that's very kind of small numbers of treatments, and most of them go through the standard technology process. And that's pretty rigid in its approach. That has some pros and cons in terms of involvement of patients. But yeah, I'm sure we'll get into the discussion around that. But very similar to Scotland, universal healthcare system. And the main thing that Kate already touched on, it is different between NICE and SMC, is NICE has what's called the mandatory funding requirement. And that means when NICE gives guidance, because it's technically guidance, to the NHS, the NHS is legally obligated, with a small number of exceptions, to implement that within a certain period of time. So if NICE gives guidance that patients should, within a certain kind of indication, should receive a treatment, then the NHS hospitals where they are being treated are legally required to provide that, or at least to put the funding in place to do so.
Oh, really interesting. And one of the things we're thinking about here is about when patients can get involved in the process. So my take on Australia is that really patients can't really get involved really till the appraisal process, so quite near the end, which might be more similar to Scotland. But my understanding is in England at NICE, you can actually get involved a lot earlier. And what does that look like, Zack?
So before you even have an appraisal, there's something called early scientific advice. That is entirely optional. Companies can choose to use that before they consider a NICE appraisal or not. And when they do that, they might include patients. That bit's really, really early. It's during the development phase. And that's to help them address kind of issues in the clinical trials, to say, what are organisations like NICE going to think of that? That's completely separate from the appraisal process. That's a really, really early opportunity. I'd like to actually see that mandated and to involve patients, but we're not there yet.
And
so that's early, isn't it?
Just to jump in, so that's back at like phase 2, phase 3 of trial, is it? And so patients are getting a bit of a say about what that looks like?
So I'll talk about the actual appraisal process where patients get early involved in a moment, but this is years before you even have an appraisal. And it's like you say, whilst they're potentially still designing some of the clinical trials, the idea is mostly for them to seek input from the HTA body, but also to include patients in that discussion. It's not in any way binding, it's just an advisory meeting to say, this is some of the issues that might exist. When we actually get to an appraisal process, obviously when a company is ready to submit, patient organisations get involved from the very beginning. So the first thing you can get involved in is something called scoping, and that's actually where you review whether or not there should be an appraisal. So you identify, in cancer, the answers that always should be an appraisal. So the scoping is more about understanding what comparator treatment should we be comparing against? Is the patient population right? And again, because you've already been through licensing, generally the appraisal's in line with the licensed indication. So it's mostly about understanding, are we looking at the right point in the pathway? And then we get into the actual appraisal proper, so to speak.
Oh, that's interesting. So quite early on, you can see if there's an issue with what the comparator is, for example, and identify it. And how soon does that happen before it actually ends up going, through and ending at appraisal?
So the scoping happens a long time before it actually even gets marketing authorization. So one of the big shifts we've had in England over the last few years is that NICE appraisals now take place very early, and they aim to give guidance shortly after marketing authorization. So they try to stop there being much of a gap between it being safe and effective to use and then reimbursed on the NHS. So what that means is a lot of the appraisal takes place before you've even got a license. It kind of assumes you will get a license. So some of the scoping takes place about 18 months before the end of the appraisal. And again, about a similar time before you've even got a license. That can be good in terms of very rapid access, but it also means you're doing an appraisal in an uncertain context because you don't know the license for certain. And obviously the data is not as clear as it will be in about 18 months' time.
Right. And so, Kate, it's different in Scotland. Can you tell us a bit about how patients are involved in the Scottish process and what it looks like? I know you sent me a lovely diagram, which I'm happy to share. Tell me when you want me to bring it up and I will.
If you could just bring it up now, that would be helpful. So essentially in Scotland, I think it operates very similarly to how it does in Australia. So we typically get involved at the appraisal stage, which I think, as Deb sort of mentioned, it is quite a late part in the process to be involved. And there is a trend towards earlier engagement in SMC. So there's, I think it's a pan UK scheme called the Innovative Licensing and Access Pathway, so ILAPS. And basically that's a collaboration between our regulatory body and all of the UK HTA bodies. And I think the idea is to work with industry, including on sort of patient engagement as early on as possible, so that by the time you get to HTA, it's almost sort of a red stamp of approval. And so lots of issues are ironed out as you go. And I think that's a really sort of important process, but it's in very, I think it's early days, and I'll be interested to see how that sort of pans out in Scotland. But in terms of how it,
Oh, I was just going to say it's an interesting one for me to put in the memory because, you know, SMC, I'm going to call it lean, and I think we have a fairly lean HTA system here. And so thinking about how you network and yet stay lean and flexible and have that sort of ability is really interesting. Please go on.
Yeah, so I won't talk for much longer, but in terms of how we are involved in the appraisal process, this is a bit of a DIY chart, so I apologise. But I think it's fair to say in Scotland, I think patients, and Zack might disagree with this, but we're quite happy with how patients are involved in the actual process itself, because we went through a very similar review to what's happening in Australia about 6 years ago. I think that the system of patient involvement is very much co-designed between patients, the SMC and the health boards, and also industry. And we are able to provide feedback to them through a public involvement network that meets once a month. And that's very effective. And I think, as Anne said, it's a very lean organisation and they're very approachable. So any issues that sort of arise, we basically tell them and work together to resolve them. So I think that's really important about the SMC. And in terms of where we get involved in the actual process, so after the industry submission has been reviewed for the scientific evidence, and there's a sort of draft guidance, patient groups are sent a form to complete, and we comment on things like the advantages and disadvantages of the medicine and what patients and carers think, and send detailed written feedback on that. And we can comment on that in the actual appraisal, as Deb said, so we can sit there and answer questions that arise. And I think that's not always been the case, and that's something we really pressed for in Scotland, because it didn't make sense to us that you couldn't answer questions about something that you'd put together. And I think one final important process that came into being from the review was a special sort of process for rare and end-of-life medicines, where there's an actual sort of committee meeting that takes place if it looks like a drug is being turned down, where doctors, the SMC committee and patients basically sit down together and scope out the sort of holistic benefits of a medicine to patients and why it should be approved. And that's a really nice meeting, and it's a good opportunity to sort of have a very informal discussion with the SMC about our perspectives. And all of these written submissions get disseminated to the committee and discussed in the full assessment meeting, and then they're incorporated into the guidance at the end. So we are very much involved both in writing and verbally, and also in the strategy as well, which I think is important. But just one final point is, and I agree with what Deb was saying, is that I think, again, this is a very late stage of a really long clinical development program. So what we try to do in advocacy is engage with industry as early on as possible. So we have community advisory boards where we try and tell companies about how they should prepare for market access in the UK and other countries. And what patient evidence that they need to be generating as they go forward. And we get involved in regulatory discussions as well, so that by the time we get to the HTA, patients have been involved throughout the process, which I think is really important.
Kate, I wonder, can I just divert slightly from the questions, because what you were saying there led in really nicely to a question Nuella had in the chat, which was, she was saying, so what would you consider common questions that aren't really covered in clinical trials that you might do a survey for? I know we're tight for time, but what are sort of some of the top of mind? And Zack, you might like to add some to that.
The first point, just in general, in answer to that question, is that I think, so as part of clinical trials, companies should be gathering quality of life data. And we did an analysis in myeloma, and I think only 40% of companies use quality of life tools. So we really advocate for them to build in the surveys to their clinical development programs. And the types of questions in terms of kind of specific things that we ask patients is things that the industry may have thought of, but need a sort of patient perspective, if that makes sense. So asking them about what specific side effects might mean in the real world. So sort of interpreting kind of what a grade 2, grade 3 side effect means to patients, because I think industry and other stakeholders might view it very differently to patients. And we ask questions, for example, and we have quite a few toxic medicines in myeloma that are very effective, but have very severe side effects. So we ask them questions about the impact that they have on kind of getting washed and dressed and on their carer, whereas industry might sell it a bit differently to how we do that. So it's about sort of looking at the specific medicine in question and thinking about kind of what might be important to patients and what data you might need to generate on that.
Yeah, so I'm hearing sometimes that clinical benefit and how it translates into a real benefit for patients and how you can gather that knowledge. Zack, did you want to add anything to that? I've got loads of other questions for you if you didn't.
Yeah, just to talk a little bit more about some of the differences, I suppose, between the SMC process in Scotland and the NICE process in England. I quite often say that if we put the best bits of both processes together, we'd have a pretty good HTA system. Unfortunately, that's not the case. But some of the pros that NICE has is obviously some of the earlier engagement. I touched on scoping already, but there's also something called technical engagement, and that's where you get to have a specific meeting with different stakeholders where you review what the big issues are going to be in the appraisal, which is something we've introduced relatively recently. It's very complicated and not particularly patient friendly, but at least it's an opportunity to deep dive into the issues early on in the process. Then, similar to Scotland, you do an evidence submission, so you can highlight any of the things you think are important. One of the bits of the process we don't have in England, and Scotland are way ahead on this, is having that patient-focused meeting, so the PACE meeting that Kate talked about. And then after that, it goes to a committee meeting where you do get the opportunity to attend the committee meeting. You get the opportunity to ask any questions about things that were in your submission, and also to comment on various things that are going on. One of the things that is not particularly good about the committee meeting process at the moment is there's a lay member who presents all of the patient group submissions. The idea there is meant to be it's consistent across all health conditions. But I will say that from my perspective, the lay member, and I've said this in NICE many, many times, the lay member makes no sense as a concept whatsoever and should 100% be abolished. Because what you get is somebody presenting at a committee meeting a boiled down summary of the submissions of the people who wrote the submissions who are present at the meeting. And just to give you an example, there's a key points section in your submission, and the lay member presents the key points and quite often doesn't put all of the things that were in your key points. So it kind of gives an insight into a NICE process, which is obviously what are the key points from a NICE perspective, not what are the key points from the patient perspective, because you don't get the chance to comment them. So that's pretty similar. Obviously, you get the chance to do something similar in Scotland. But one of the things that then is good after that in the NICE process, which is similar to what Deb's mentioned in Canada, is the opportunity to comment and appeal on documents. So the first stage, after the first committee meeting, there's a draft guidance produced that you can comment on. Then there's at least a second, and often many more than that, committee meetings where you get draft guidance after each of those that you comment on. And then you get the final guidance. And what's really good about the NICE system is after the final guidance, you actually have a right of appeal. And that's not commenting, that's actually challenging the decision. So in the event of a negative decision as a patient organisation, you're allowed to challenge it on process grounds and say, did they follow the process? Did they do things like adequately incorporate patients? Were the decisions they made reasonable? And if not, you can challenge those. And we've done that. We've successfully overturned negative decisions. And the appeal then takes it back a step for the committee to reconsider. And that's then resulted in those treatments being approved and then available as a result of those appeals. So they can be a really big opportunity to influence, and it holds the process to account to make sure that they are following the process every stage.
And that's, I think that's a really interesting learning point, but sitting underneath there is something which perhaps now you're starting to take for granted in the UK, but you can actually see these committee meetings, can't you? And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that, because of course in many places of the world, including Australia, we can't see what goes on at committee.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to describe the NICE process as transparent as mud. So it's deliberately transparent in the sense of the process takes place in public. Often it's very unclear what the discussions are because they're very technical. So it makes it difficult for stakeholders to get involved. Particularly in terms of the committee meeting, there's actually two parts to the committee meeting. So the first half is a public meeting where things like patient input are taken into account. And then the second half is just for the committee, and it's a private meeting. So the first half that takes place in public, patient experts can attend. And there's also a public gallery, so anybody who wants to can register for these meetings and go and sit along them. It's quite often filled with people from industry who are interested in seeing how the system works for their other appraisals. But the second half of the meeting, where it's private and only for the committee, patient experts are asked to leave the room with the public, which again, I think is a flaw in the process. I think if you're part of the discussions, you should be entitled to stay. You've signed a confidentiality agreement. And it also means that the difficult discussions can just take place in the second half of the meeting. And again, just to be a bit controversial, quite often that does happen. In the first half, they'll say, let's reserve that topic for discussion in the private session, which I don't think is right. And I don't think that's full transparency.
Oh, that's a really good point for us to pick up on transparency, because we think, you know, sometimes if everyone can sort of see most of it, that's transparency. But seeing and understanding is transparency, isn't it? And having it conveyed in a meaningful way. And Kate, Scotland, I think, was the first, I could be wrong, I think they were the first to have their meetings in public and have a lot of experience doing that. I know some of us here in Australia like to watch them online these days, as we watch NICE as well. What's your experience in Scotland of being at the table and being in the committee meetings?
So in terms of attending the committee meetings, I think actually NICE was first to give them credit for that. And then
sorry, Zack. Sorry, NICE.
But then SMC, I think with the reforms that came into play about 6 years ago, they opened their committees first to be observed. And I actually think some of the best developments in sort of patient involvement have come from us being allowed to watch what they're doing, because you can sort of make suggestions. Like, for example, I attended an SMC meeting where one of our submissions was read out, and at that point we weren't allowed to comment, and they read out something slightly wrong, and a committee member had a question that went unanswered. And to me and to other advocates, that type of thing is easily resolved if you have a patient actually at the table. And so we did a lot of advocacy work with the SMC on asking them for patients to sit around the table and to be able to answer questions, which we're now able to do. And I think that really, it just means that no questions are left unanswered. And I think there could be a time delay, for example, if they have a lot of questions for the patients and they're not allowed to talk, and then they have to go away and clarify them again and then come back. And for ease and transparency and for the patient voice to be heard, it's really important to be at the table. And I think for the SMC as well, sitting at the table, I find it's not an intimidating environment. I find when I've been to NICE appraisals, sometimes I've been to very challenging appraisals where it's been very intimidating, and like the committee in industry are clearly having a really academic debate about a medicine and the health economics, and sometimes you've got no idea what's going on and you feel like, oh, maybe if I speak, people might not listen or kind of stop me talking. Whereas within the SMC, I feel like they're very open. You feel like you can say things, and it's a different environment altogether than NICE. So I think it has benefited the process for patients being at the table and also just being able to observe. And if you get the chance to do it, I think you can register on the SMC website, and I think it's quite helpful to just see how they make decisions and deliberate.
Oh yes, I'd recommend that to anyone, to check out the NICE and the SMC websites, and it's a great way to drink a cup of tea late at night, and it's fascinating information. And I think you've brought out something that I want to make sure we capture here too, is that you can have process, but then there's sort of how the process is enacted, the nature of the relationship, the nature of the partnership, which you spoke to there. I'm running out of time, and I'm trying to get through all the questions. Questions will go unanswered tonight, but I don't want to miss this really important one. And Zack, I'll start with you, and it's about timely access. We always hear timely access. What does it mean to you, and what is happening in your system to try and achieve timely access?
So timely access means to me the right patient receiving the right treatment at the right time. And I would judge it from an individual level rather than from a system level. But obviously the context for having that discussion in is HTA. And the thing that I view in terms of access issues is when you don't have the reimbursement or NICE decision effectively in the UK at the time you need it as a patient. So I think quite often we forget that. We forget that there are patients waiting for treatments whilst those decisions are taking place. And NICE has actually done quite a lot of work there to shift those decisions earlier, like I said. So actually from the time between a regulatory approval and through a NICE approval and therefore reimbursement and access in the UK is now pretty short. Obviously that's not ideal, but I think it's as close as it's ever going to be, and actually not the big issue in our system. The issues in our system from an access perspective are the ones that get a negative appraisal and therefore aren't routinely available. You can get them privately if you pay, if they're licensed, but you can't get them on the public health system. But actually also, and I saw someone ask a question about this in the chat, some of the non-submissions. So because of how rigid the process is, you can actually, as a company, work out whether you think you're going to get a positive, or certainly identify whether there's very little chance that you ever getting a positive anyway. And quite often some of the decisions that would have been negative historically now just don't get appraised. So in the blood cancer space, we've seen an increasing number of non-submissions in recent years, where people or companies quite simply just don't submit their treatment to NICE, and therefore you never get a negative decision at NICE, because a NICE decision is unhelpful internationally if it's a negative, and you just don't have it available in the UK for certain indications. And that's become increasingly problematic, because obviously patients then can't routinely access it on the public healthcare system, but they could access it if they're able to pay privately, which is not really the case for many people in England.
Oh, thanks, Zack. And Kate, I'll make this our last question. And I'm sorry, I have tried to roll people's questions together a bit in the thread so that we can cover as much ground as possible in this. Kate, what's your thought about timely access and how this is trying to be achieved in Scotland?
sorry, I clicked out of Zoom then for a second. So I think essentially, I really agree with what Zack said about getting access to the right drugs to the right patient at the right time. But for me, there's also a piece around, so once there is compelling data to suggest a drug is safe and effective for use in patients, that it sort of transitions very smoothly from sort of early phase into clinical practice in access for patients without sort of hurdles or sort of unnecessary delays as well. And I think in myeloma, what we see a lot of is that drugs getting to HTA stage and then having to scramble about to find patient evidence or like real world data because companies have used the wrong comparator, or like problems that arise that we've sort of known about all along, but nothing's really happened about them. And I think the ILAP system that I mentioned before, where sort of regulators, HTA bodies, patients and industry sort of collaborate in the HTA process before it actually gets to the assessment to make sure, like, you're not going to approve all medicines or get everything right, but the process from clinical development into the clinic is as smooth as possible and there's no sort of unnecessary delays for patients. And I think that's something that we're really keen to work towards at MPE, because yeah, a lot of the time the same things happen, and it makes sense to collaborate because we're all working for patients at the end of the day.
And I think that's fascinating. It's a fascinating process which we'll watch with interest. And of course, your space now is the European space. So thank you for stepping back and looking back at Scotland as well. And we see these huge initiatives going on in Europe, you know, things like the European Health Data Space and the HTA regulation for clinical benefit going through. And we look with interest. So I know we'll want to talk more. I think I've got 1 minute to ask you one final question. I'm sorry, I'm sneaking it in. But if there's one aspect from your system that you think, you know, if I had one tip that for something that happens well in our system that I think Australia and other jurisdictions around the world should really look at, if there's, maybe it's not one, but if there's, what should we really look at that's done well in your jurisdiction? That's throwing that to you first, Zack.
So from a UK-wide perspective, and I don't want to steal Kate's answer, I think the PACE process in Scotland is absolutely, but I'll leave Kate to talk about that. But I think that's better than anything that's actually happening in the NICE process. But the one thing I would steal from the NICE process is the public transparency, making every single step of the process out in the public domain, and making every document public. Obviously, there's some things that are confidential, but making the statements around what the decisions are, what draft guidance is, putting that in the public domain, really gives you as a patient organisation the opportunity to critique and push back. And often, like I say, it's transparent as mud, because you can actually see it says something, but it doesn't mean anything. But at least it gives you the chance to challenge, critique and push back on process and make sure that patients are getting involved at every stage.
Thanks, Zack. And Kate, your thoughts?
Yeah, Zack was about to steal my answer, because I think the PACE process, or the patient and clinician engagement process within the SMC, is a really top class method of engaging patients, because I think you get the opportunity to provide more detailed written feedback on the benefits of a medicine to patients, and also just sit down and deliberate with doctors and the SMC committee in quite an informal setting, and you really feel listened to. So you can see the SMC executive really like taking notes as you present the patient opinion, and then that gets taken and presented to the full committee meeting and helps them make a decision again in a very flexible way. And I think that is really beneficial. And a final point, and I don't think this is unique to the SMC, but one of the things that came out of the review 6 years ago was investment in public and patient involvement, and it led to the employment of staff dedicated to that. And I think that's a really important point, because having 2 contact people there who you can pick up the phone to and ask about submissions has actually transformed the way it's operating in Scotland. So I think that that should be replicated by other HTA bodies as well if they don't have that.
Well, thank you, Kate, and thank you, Zack. I'm going to share a final screen because it's a few quick screens. Thank you everyone who's been able to stay on long. Your time is really valuable. I really want to firstly thank our wonderful speakers, Zack Pemberton-Whitely, Kate Morgan and Deb Maskens. Particularly thank you to Kate and Zack. We had an exciting start to this webinar, but we got there and your content was wonderful. So I think it's a tribute to how much you know in this space for how people have persisted despite some of the technical issues. On the screen there, I'm thanking Patient Voice Initiative's gold sponsors. We're really indebted to these companies for getting behind making the patient voice seen and heard and valued in health technology assessment. And those are our gold sponsors, and those are our very treasured silver sponsors as well. And if you're interested in some of the things we've talked about here, you want to find out more about having a voice in health technology assessment, we have our resources, we have our Facebook site, we have our LinkedIn, and we have these webinars. And finally, I would like to thank Claire, who stepped in at very short notice to give us technical backup tonight. So thank you, Claire, and thank you all for joining us today.